How to Lead Through Complexity. Welcome to the Better Boards podcast series, the podcast for chairs, CEOs, non-executive directors, company secretaries, and their advisors. Every episode is filled with practical insights and learning from those inside boardrooms. We discuss what really matters and highlight actionable steps you can take to enhance the performance of your board. I'm delighted to talk with Dr. Nadine Rinck. Nadine is partner at Egon Zehnder in Munich. Egon Zehnder doesn't need any further introductions. It is one of the preeminent leadership advisory firms. Nadine talks about their latest CEO studies and reveals some results. Some of them I found really surprising. She shares the implications of the study and what it means for CEOs and also boards, and above all, nomination committees. There are some really important conclusions in this podcast for nomination committees about how they should look on the candidates and on CEOs. And what are really the things that need to be developed, that should be developed, and have probably not come so much to the fore in the past, when there was a very different understanding of what leadership means. We see a big shift of what it means to be a leader today than what it meant to be a leader a decade ago. Nadine, thank you so much for contributing to the Better Boards podcast series.
Hi, Sabine. Yes, great to be here.
Nadine, you will tell us some insights from a study you did with CEOs. Tell us what's on the minds of CEOs today.
Yeah, so we started by asking 500 CEOs globally, really across sectors. And we started by asking them what is their outlook on the future. 95% of the people we asked actually expect groundbreaking systemic changes in the next decade coming towards us.
Wow.
Yes.
And when you talk about systemic changes, I mean, people always talked about change, but what is so different about, and what do you mean by systemic change?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for this question. The difference obviously lies in the systemic element. And the root cause for this systemic change or challenge, as one could say, clearly is the level of complexity that we are currently facing. I think nowadays we're really exposed to more dramatic, more rapid, more parallel, and just more changes happening at the same time. And even worse, they're all interconnected. To understand this a bit better, we had asked CEOs what these specific systemic challenges are that they are facing at the moment, that they're making their lives so difficult. And the top 5 most critical challenges that they mentioned were first talent in terms of acquisition as well as development. Then secondly, AI adoption as well as the impact it might have. Then thirdly, market disruptions, that was really mentioned across all sectors. Then fourth, geopolitical instability. And finally, climate change and its ecological impact.
I mean, I know that talent is on the top 5, but I'm surprised that talent really is the number 1 spot.
Well, for us as headhunters, it's obviously not so surprising. I think drivers for this are the demographic change that we have, the labor shortage in many countries, and the difficult to attract good talents. One could even say war of talent. And also the expectations of employees have changed over the last years.
Yeah, I feel it myself, employing some Gen Z people. Very different thinking, very different motivations, yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about this complexity. What does it really mean for leaders?
The world is currently moving from complicated to complex. Complicated means that there's a solution. So you can, if you do your homework, if you lever your insights from past experience, if you invest resources, then you can be sure you will find a solution. This is how we have been raised in the past, so to say. Now, with complexity, no matter how many things and resources you throw at it, money, people, and whatever, you will not necessarily find a solution. And there is no existing solution. And of course, that creates uncertainty and to some degree also fear with the people. Yeah, and I mean, this, of course, has an impact also on the role of the CEO. The role is changing. In the past decade, we probably looked a bit more for leaders who can lead with a strong element of collaboration and influencing. When we looked for CEOs who take a bit like the role of a good team coach, who give impulses, who coordinate, who act as team players. And nowadays, we observe more and more that there's a call for leadership, which really provides for guidance and clearer directions. I'm not saying that the CEOs no longer need to be team players who collaborate. Of course, they have to. But I think in the future, the CEOs will be expected much more to give guidance and direction. I think CEOs need to take the role a little bit like the compasses for their businesses that help them navigate this complexity.
To be honest, I'm not so surprised about that one, because reading social science studies, in times of uncertainty, people look for this direction. And we also see it, of course, in politics. So that's interesting, but not this surprising, actually. But it leads me almost to the next question. Does it really mean that CEOs need to solve all this themselves? Do they have more room to basically make a decision and others have to follow?
I think that doesn't mean that CEOs should start being hierarchical now. I think this won't be accepted. And of course, it also doesn't mean that CEOs will need to solve all problems themselves. We have actually asked the CEOs where they turn to for advice and for sparring when it comes to solving these complexity issues. And it was quite interesting what we found. So 63% answered that they draw on their peers, so that means other CEOs, as well as on their executive leadership team, which is somehow what you would expect. But I was quite surprised to hear that only 17% said that they turn to their independent board members for discussion or advice, and only even 13% turn to their chairs.
That's amazing.
I think, it is. I think that's a little bit also a call of action for boards to change their roles. So not only CEOs need to change their roles, but also boards who need to step more into the role of active advisors and sparings partners of their CEOs and define their mandates a little bit more in terms of what can I do to make my CEO become better and support him or her in navigating this complexity.
Absolutely makes sense. And then this is a very important shift also for our listeners. When I work with boards, I see some of them are already there, but a lot of them are not there. And I think the figures you just shared with us, do you think they also point to a trust issue there? Because the figures are really shockingly low, to be honest.
I agree. I mean, what we observed during COVID, that boards and executive management boards came much closer together, much more pragmatically worked together, and there was a really advisory relationship, somehow what we're aiming at. But if we look at these numbers, I think we're not yet there. And I think there's still a bit more room for improvement.
So our listeners really love practical insights and advice. How can CEOs tackle really these challenges?
Now I will have to disappoint your listeners. It's actually not simply a matter of learning some specific new skills that I could list here or that you can learn on a weekend seminary. It's a bit more deep and it's also broader. I think the leaders will need to develop adaptive abilities. So it's less about installing new apps. It's more about updating the entire operating system. It's really to trigger a change of your leadership identity, of your leadership personality in the future. The focus will be much more in emotional intelligence. And at the Egon Zehnder, we believe that this really requires a shift more towards inner development.
Wow. Now, what does inner development mean? It sounds like hard work that takes time.
You're spot on. It means developing a personal growth mindset. It means really actively fostering personal growth. And that means dedicating time to it, which I know is not so easy in the lives of busy CEOs. To make this a bit more tangible, we have identified 3 meta competencies that help CEOs or leaders more broadly to embark on this journey of personal growth. And you can really think of these 3 meta competencies like the baseline of a good song. So as long as this baseline is there, it somehow constitutes the frame for all themes or melodies that might involve or evolve from it. It means as long as a leader cultivates these three meta competencies, they can quite flexibly and much easier adopt what is necessary in specific situations on a case-by-case basis or develop what is needed.
Come on, share them with us.
I wanted to create some tension here. So, the first one is self-awareness. That means the capacity for self-reflection and true honesty with oneself. It requires the leaders to very critically look inwards and sometimes maybe also with the help of a sparings partner or of a coach. We experience that on top level, very few leaders actually have people around them who give them honest feedback, at least in the workplace. In the family, it might be a bit different, but in the workplace. So being self-aware is actually not so easy if you are at the top of the house with little true and honest feedback. The second competency would be relational capabilities. That means relating to others, building a network, engaging with this network, and here it comes building trust, what you just mentioned. It entails really listening to others. Today, leadership is probably more and more about approachability, authenticity, and also empathy. It's also about showing vulnerability as a leader.
Yeah, makes sense.
Good. And the third one, it sounds actually the easiest one, but I think in reality it is the most difficult one, is adaptability. That means that one has to get rid of the things that one has learned in the past and be brave enough to unlearn. So let go of outdated belief and by unlearning, make space for the new. Constantly push yourself to connect new dots, get rid of old patterns, and have the mindset that really embraces change.
Yeah, and our listeners will hear that we are both from Germany, so I think that might be particularly difficult in certain cultures. Have you noticed any differences between cultures?
In terms of adaptability, that's a good question. I probably haven't, but that doesn't mean that there aren't.
I see very often when I talk with board members as part of the board evaluations that nomination committees really struggle these days in defining precisely what they need, what they want. Very often they have to make compromises. What conclusions should boards and particularly nomination committees draw from all you talked about?
I mean, one aspect when selecting obviously is the CV and the experience, and this will always remain an important part. But I think the main conclusion is that you need to understand your candidates a bit broader, understand their behaviors and their personalities as well. For nomination committees, that means if you look at the internal talent or CEO succession pipelines, it means that they should really get to know the candidates early on throughout their career. So not only when they speak in the board or when the CEO selection process has actually taken place, but much earlier on, create touch points, meet them on events, maybe even create special events for this, monitor them, how do they do things, and establish some sort of a relationship with them so that they have as many data points as possible from past experience with them to capture their broader personality. Mm-hmm. And when we're looking about or at external candidates in the CEO succession process, apart from probing the right experience and the technical skill set, obviously, it's the same. It's about discovering their personalities. You can do that via psychometric tests. You can take references. You can run workshops to simulate joint working sessions and see how they behave. But I probably would recommend to really try to bring the candidates out of their comfort zones to see and experience more of their personalities. I know it's quite popular to go for dinners and maybe even bring partners, and that's, of course, a good starting point, but I would probably even go a bit further to take people out of their comfort zones and see them in different settings and environments. Yeah.
I just wanted to refer, because when we prepared for this podcast, you actually shared a wonderful story, and I wondered if you're prepared to share it here.
Yeah. So with one share, I was discussing how we could do this, and the company was sponsoring the national rowing team. And we came up with the idea that the chair actually takes a rowing boat together with the final candidate, the chair being the captain then in the boat and the candidate being the rower. They went together on the lake for an hour or so, and it took both of them out of their comfort zones, none of them being professional rowers, of course. But it unfolded an interesting dynamic, right? And a lot of situations you could never prepare for. And it was making visible the bond from human to human much more.
Fantastic. I mean, credit to them for having actually done it. I just want to bring it together somehow for our listeners. Very concretely, what skills and characteristics of candidates are now becoming really more important?
The answer is that there is not a specific skill or a specific competency. The answer is much more in searching for the potential in people. So potential that candidates bring to develop themselves in the future. And we at Egon Zehnder, we have a very specific framework with 4 dimensions on how we look at potential, being curiosity, insight, engagement, and determination. Among these 4, curiosity is probably the most important one. It's about the way in which one learns and applies learning, seeks feedback, and changes to grow personally and professionally. And I think this will be the driving force which will distinguish most impactful leaders.
I could talk for hours, but we don't have hours. So, and at the end, there's always this challenging question. What 3 things should our listeners really take away from this podcast episode?
I think it's the 3 meta competencies that will help them navigate complexities. I'll repeat them. The first one is self-awareness. The second one is relational capabilities. And the third one is adaptability.
Fantastic. Nadine, thank you so much for contributing to the BetterBots podcast series.
Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this podcast episode. If you would like to see that we cover a certain topic on this podcast, or if you would like to have further information about what we discussed in this podcast, or about the work we do with boards, how we conduct board evaluations, how we approach board development programs, do get in touch with Nadine or myself. We are very much looking forward to hearing from you. Once again, thank you for listening.